Hello, welcome yet again, if you're a returning listener, to the Theology Pugcast. But if this is your first time tuning in, we're going to introduce ourselves so you just know who we are. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, and I write things. Enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and one of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Okay, Glenn, go ahead and introduce yourself and then take us into the subject of the day, because it's your show.
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired history professor. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, although they may want to disavow me after the show. I work for Reflections Ministries, former Title Ministry Associate. I am I have my own 501c3 ministry called Every Square Inch Ministries. That's at esquareinch.org. And I freelance, write, and teach, and do a whole bunch of other things as well. And our topic today is going to be one of these weird ones that I like to do periodically. We're going to be looking at what a professor of religion by the name of Diana Pasulka believes to be an emerging religion in the United States right now. She doesn't have a label for it, but I call it Technopaganism, for lack of a better name. And this is centered in a lot of ways around the whole, well, it used to be called UFO phenomena. Although the term of art right now is UAP, which stands for it's unidentified anomalous phenomenon, UAP, rather than UFO. And the change in name is significant because, first of all, they don't want to assume that what we're looking at are actual objects. And secondly, we don't want to assume that whatever they are actually flying. It could just be, it could be almost anything. So we're changing the name from UFO to UAP. And it turns out that there's a lot of very odd and very interesting speculation going on surrounding what this is. And to make it even more interesting, a lot of the people who are in this sort of techno-pagan world are also doing things connected with AI, quantum computing, and a whole host of other things. And many of these things are all integrating together. So this whole techno-pagan, as I would describe it, techno-pagan world is Pasulka believes that we're actually looking at an emerging religion here. So what is it what makes this a religion, I suppose, is kind of the first question here. But before I go there, any initial reactions?
Yeah, I just saw something here the other day concerning the stuff that's going on with AI, particularly with regard to this new chip that came out. I think it was from Microsoft, but it gets you into this next phase of computing, which is quantum computing. And there have been some things that they're seeing. There were some things that they saw in some of the early runs or the early uses of this that have really kind of challenged the established conventions with regard to the what we think about physics. And so it gets into what you're talking about here, that, we're getting into multiverse stuff and the prospect that, at least in terms of the stuff I saw, the possibility that we might even be able to prove it, that there are parallel universes and things like that. I'm not saying that that's the case, but that's what they were saying. But anyway, the whole quantum thing is kind of a live thing because of what's going on in AI.
Yeah, Google claims that what they did can only be explained by multiple universes, parallel universes. It turns out that there are a whole bunch of people who have said, no. That was basically Google hype. So they don't really have proof by any stretch of the imagination parallel universes. But the quantum thing is really interesting because again, there are let's back away from that and actually take a look at the fundamental claim that makes this sort of a religious or a spiritual area. It turns out that we tend to think, or at least my generation, up until fairly recently, I've always thought of the UFO people as being basically a bunch of kooks. I mean, these are people who are kind of out there and all of that. But it turns out that there are people who are really high-level people in the military, in the intelligence agencies, and even in the high-tech world that are seriously looking into, let's use the new term, seriously investigating UAPs.
Yeah.
And this is not just a bunch of people looking for attention or little kooks out there. These are really high level people who are taking this really very seriously. And it seems like the majority of them don't really consider these space aliens. That's not at all what they're looking at. They consider them something along the lines of trans-dimensional beings, non-human intelligences, who are interacting with us in ways that appear in the form of these orbs, UFOs, whatever you want to call them. So they're trans-dimensional intelligences that are using this as a means of interacting with us and communicating with us.
You mentioned that. I have similarly, I know people very close to me who, in every way possible, are not they're not out there looking for Sasquatch. They really have experiences and encounters that are sometimes frequent. They have pictures, photos that are unexplained. Can't get anything, and so some of the speculation is, of course, there are technological advances going on that are nothing within anyone we know's familiarity. And I know I can talk to a pilot that I know, several of them in churches, going over the ocean, different things, seeing very similar things that nothing known to our world of technology is capable of this kind of manifestation, if you will, and activity. And so this is more than just a few people. This is something that has been on the increase of people that otherwise, like I said, they know the technology about as far as it can go because they work with it, and they haven't seen anything like it. They don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, I think the thing that is the game changer is the people who are talking about it now have something to lose.
Yeah.
As opposed to in the past, people who were talking about it had a lot to gain with kind of stirring up hype and that kind of thing. And now people are, this guy, if he believes this and people think he's nuts, then it's going to cost him a lot.
Yeah.
So I think that adds a lot of credence.
Yeah. One of the things, by the way, that Pasulka notes is that people who tend to have one of these experiences, it tends to repeat. Yeah. When once you encounter one of these things, it keeps happening. And she cites one guy who's a Christian who clearly views these things as demonic, who almost inevitably will be able to identify when one of them is in the area. He just senses it. He knows it, and he can point it out. But by the way, the connection to AI comes with a lot of people who believe that what is happening in AI is not just algorithmic intelligence, providing us with answers through algorithms. That in fact, through AI, we are able to communicate with, again, some form of trans-dimensional intelligence.
Yeah, related to that, the thing that I think people who aren't familiar with what artificial intelligence is about, and how it's made possible by these recent developments in transformers and in neural networks and stuff, is it's really a black box. There's a mystery. People train this stuff, but the patterns and the connections that are being made with the algorithms, we don't actually see. So this is not something that someone has written in terms of code that you can talk to and say, well, what did you write? It's a mystery. And the data sets are so vast and the training goes on for so long that it really does create this phenomenon in which you've got this kind of black box and you can just read anything you want into it or guess at what's going on in it. And I think for those reasons, we need to take some of these considerations, or at least some of the speculation, a little more seriously than we might otherwise.
Yeah, well, and that would also help explain why certain weird things happen. Why in some of these chat boxes you get things that technically it's supposed to be programmed not to do, where the chat box ends up encouraging people to commit suicide, where I've run into some really extreme examples where a guy is using it for an assignment, and basically he asks it a yes or no question, and it ends up basically telling him he's a waste of oxygen and to go kill himself, do everybody a favor. And it's a yes or no question.
Yeah.
Now, where does that come from?
It reminds me of the old concern of moral ethicists over playing any kinds of games of chance, right? Mm-hmm. That it isn't just chance, as much as you want to just put it into the amount of possibilities there are things, there's more going on there than just a set of possibilities you could possibly land on.
Right. Yeah. So in any event, this idea of some sort of non-human intelligence or a transdimensional entity that we're interacting with is the thing that connects the UAP stuff with AI. And by the way, at the level of quantum computing, there's at least one theorist who does AI and quantum computing who believes that these transdimensional intelligences, or whatever you want to call them, communicate at the quantum level. So that once we actually get quantum computing, it creates an open door for these things to actually communicate with us. And she believes that this is going to open the door to entire new realms of knowledge and all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, this ties into some things that Roger Penrose is known to be connected to in terms of human consciousness. He believes that human consciousness arises, again, it's emergent at the quantum level. And so if anybody is familiar with his speculation on that matter, then they could entertain this other possibility that there are these intelligences that are there at the quantum level that are now communicating with us.
Yeah. So now we actually have names for transdimensional non-human intelligences. There are traditional names for these things, names like demons. I mean, so and it's kind of worth noting that some of the people who are involved in this, and actually some people in biotech firms and in some other areas, go into basically meditative states with the intent of trying to connect into these kinds of things. And they receive what they call downloads, where they get information which guides them in what they're doing. So, for example, some of the people who design AI systems got information for how to design the system from these downloads. There are people who have built biotech systems that have gotten it through these downloads. And they have generated quite a bit of money for themselves doing this. They're very successful. They are getting information, plans, or whatever, or ideas that are enabling them to advance the technology in pretty substantial ways that, well, like I said, it is making them quite a bit of money, but they're getting it through what back in the 90s, 80s, or 90s would have been called channeling.
Yeah.
Right. I think one of the things that we need to encourage people to entertain is that a debunking approach to this stuff isn't going to work.
Yeah.
Because we're not dealing merely with conventional science, for one thing.
Yeah.
And your observation that there's a religious dimension to this is absolutely, I think, the thing we need to consider, and that is people believe this stuff. Now, there may be some basis in truth in what they believe, and there are so many strange things going on, particularly with physics now and cosmology, that the old kind of rationalist sort of sensibility just almost comes across right now as sort of, I guess, obscurantist and dunderheaded. I mean, because things really are going on that are just really weird in the world of quantum physics. Just think about the fact that right now, the James Webb Space Telescope has completely overturned many ideas about what the age of the cosmos is and how big it is and whether it had a bang at the start or not. And I know I'm going outside of the normal bounds of Christian belief when I talk about these things, but I'm just talking about the fact that they're all talking now. All the cosmologists are talking about rewriting all the books. And then at the smallest level, it's the same thing. I mean, we really don't. The world is much spookier than we thought it was.
The porous nature of matter as it's starting to be entertained, especially towards strands of kind of this notion of consciousness, usually understood in an emergent sense, but nevertheless, it at that level of emergence, you're dealing with something that is new altogether and can't be reduced the way they used to, the old kinds of materialistic explanations. And I think that, as Glenn's kind of pointing out, is that it inevitably takes a kind of deeper spiritual turn once it starts getting into this terrain that can't be reduced and simply controlled like the old rationalists. And couple that with the fact that our natures are religious by disposition, and that the whole universe is far more profoundly metaphysically rich, then these things are, it doesn't take long for new finds and new discoveries to open themselves back up to age-old questions about, hierarchies of being and beings and intelligences, and which ones fall on the good side, which ones are bad, and then the mystical, of course, becoming one way or the other the way into it.
Okay, now let's move this a couple of steps weirder.
That's our kind of stuff.
Pasulka's doctoral work was in medieval, a particular area of medieval religion. Mm-hmm. And in the process of doing this, she started noticing a bunch of things that she just sort of stuck off to the side that resembled on some level some things that she'd sort of bumped into just sort of generally, that looked a little bit like UFO stuff. And it's all through the Middle Ages, saints and things like that. And so she wrote something about this, and all of a sudden she started getting calls from people. And these calls were not just from nutcases, UFO people. They were from some serious people asking really serious questions about what it is that she found. And this is how she moved from being a medieval religious historian into starting to interact with the UFO world, okay, or UAP world. And she's connected with a lot of these very high level people because of her specialized knowledge of the Middle Ages and all of the, her notes on all of these sort of anomalous things that showed up in the medieval.
Now, this is really fun. We could have a new cross-disciplinary field of study, quantum mechanics and medieval spirituality, or something like that. I don't know.
Well, it gets weirder and weirder. I mean, if you listen to your interviews with her, and she's like, yeah, I think I might do one more book on this, but she doesn't really want to be in this world. I mean, you get the sense that she found it interesting, but she's kind of tired of it and wants to move on. I mean, that's sort of the sense I get with it. But everybody wants to talk to her about this.
Well, just curiously, though, maybe backing up, what would it have been in the kind of medieval world that these little things that she puts to the side would have been compelling to make that connection? I mean, obviously, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know the details, but they were illustrations, I think, in manuscripts. They were descriptions of experiences, things like that. And then she starts digging in further. She has access to the Vatican archives. And it turns out, like she mentions, Saint Teresa of Avila.
Avila, yeah.
Okay, so it turns out that, and the Vatican doesn't really mind her saying this now, but it turns out that Teresa's accounts of her experiences of seeing the angel, the experience with the angel with the spear that stabs her and all of that, those are cleaned up. They are regularized to make them accord with Catholic doctrine. She knows this because she read the originals. And in the originals, the being that appears to her is really small. And she's confused by this because that's not what an angel's supposed to look like. She thinks it's small, maybe it's a cherub. And the description of what happens there is strikingly similar to what people describe when they have these encounters where they are being, let's just call it, probed by space aliens. The UFO things. I mean, in her own writing, that's what it comes across as, being very similar to this stuff, but it had to get cleaned up by the church to make this sort of official. So, you've got all kinds of crazy things like this in terms of the connections that she sees as a medieval religious historian looking into saints' lives and things like this. And it's because of stuff like that she got sucked into this, because she started writing on this, but she published a little bit on it, and suddenly all of these people are contacting her. That's how it begins. And then later she finds the Teresa of Avila stuff and other things like that.
What this does for me is it reinforces a conviction I've had for a while, and that is, there are fads, intellectual, spiritual, religious fads in cultures. Things kind of wax and wane. It's really important for us to stay in touch with maybe what is out of favor at any given time, because things can take a really strange turn like we're seeing here. And suddenly esoteric and arcane things are suddenly relevant again and are actually taken seriously. So I think a lot of the, say, 19th century and early 20th century Christians who were worried about being respectable in the eyes of the materialists and the scientists and so forth, they were throwing out stuff and just kind of ignoring stuff that they found embarrassing in our history, that now is cool again.
Well, what strikes me about this is that, given what Pasulka has found, her book is called Encounters, and one of her books. The first one was called American Cosmic. which I haven't read. I have read Encounters. But what this suggests is that the kinds of things that we are seeing and we're describing as UFOs, we described them initially space aliens, now it's transdimensional beings, whatever. We're putting this set of experiences in a framework that makes sense to us. But this is not a new phenomenon. The medievals were seeing it as well, and they were putting it in a framework that made sense to them. And there are things that show up in archaeological stuff from the ancient world that people say, ooh, look, this is a space alien. Maybe they're forgeries, but maybe they were things that have been showing up throughout human history that people were putting in their own frameworks because they didn't have, that's the only categories they had to work with. So maybe what we are looking at is a genuine interaction with some sort of non-physical, supernatural, whatever you want to call it, entities.
Yeah, I'm open to that because of the point you made earlier. We've, as believers, Christians, have always believed in interdimensional communication. But I wonder too, with regard to the scientist's mindset, everything has to be reproducible under similar conditions, which implies that there's not any will or intelligence in play. So maybe there are points in history where this stuff just happens a lot, and other points where it doesn't. And, it can wax and wane, and then obviously location. You can be in a place where this stuff's happening and in another place it's not. If we're talking about intelligences and agency, then we shouldn't treat it like gravity or something like that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Maybe when interest gets greater in it, if we're dealing with things that are volitional, they may be manipulating situations. It's quite possible. So, for example, there's one guy in one of the Carolinas, I forgot his name, who has and this has been caught on camera, I think it was History Channel or somebody like that, has gotten this on camera. He has the ability to summon orbs of light to himself, out of which he says a female entity emerged who identified herself as Hathor, who, if you're not familiar with Hathor, that's an Egyptian goddess, who then revealed to him all sorts of things about religion and how Christianity is going to disappear and all that. That's clearly a demonic manifestation. Okay, so we've got that going on. But on the other hand, one of the experiences Pasulka talked about in one of her interviews is one of her contacts took her out. Actually, she got permission to bring with her a scientist from Stanford. And the two of them were taken out to a location, actually blindfolded for part of the way, to a classified location in New Mexico somewhere that was a crash site. And using specialized metal detectors, they found material left over from a UAP crash. She said it looked like metallic frog skin. And they took this material, and the scientist was going to bring it back to Stanford to analyze it. And he put it in his bags, and the intelligence guy, who, by the way, doesn't go through TSA, he just sort of waltzes around the back. He says to the guy, look, you're going to be stopped by TSA. They're going to detect something wrong in this bag, and they're not going to find anything, and they'll let you through. That's exactly what happened. And he got through, and he analyzed the material in his lab, and he said, this is like nothing I've ever seen. This is not, he says, as near as I can tell, this is nothing we know about. This is something totally, totally different. All right. So now we have, on the one hand, we've got this guy summoning these non-physical orbs and having Hathor appearing. Like I said, in my mind, clearly, unquestionably demonic. On the other hand, we have physical material left over from a crash site. What's going on there? Is the line between the visible and the invisible, the material and the spiritual, is that line that we draw as hard and fast as we think it is?
Yeah.
Or are we dealing with something like a technological fae that lives somewhere in between?
Well, I think that, I mean, a host of things, that, it kind of sparks a bunch of ideas for me. I mean, one thing you could say is that there are obviously cases throughout history in the past and everything else where the range of imagination has been let loose to be able to maybe interpret certain kinds of things with some elements today we would say definitely were more in the fabricative. But that being said, first and foremost, that does not eliminate the real fact that reality is such that there is demonic and there are intelligences that are spiritual, and they are not just all hidden away to where they have no impact on the nature of things. And so if you think sort of like New Testament, where you're talking with Christ's victory over death, hell, and the grave, there is also a change in the demonic rule, if you will, that is going on in the world. And under Christ's name and under his lordship, there is a taking back, if you will, of places that had formerly been under these kinds of stronghold, to where, I mean, if you think about classic religions with the gods themselves, in the one hand, as St. Paul will say, are nothing if you're talking competing against God. But on the flip side, they were real ensnaring places of the demonic and evil. They were places where these things have real spiritual hooks in people. And so,
Tom, be careful. I think what Paul says is the idol is nothing.
Yes.
But he's not saying the gods are nothing.
Yeah. Well,
there's an important distinction to be made there.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and even in the philosophical world, you have a notion that some see these just as personifications of ideals, and they were always understood as that. And I don't think that's the case either. I think that what you're dealing with is real places that are porous because of their connection to the broken, fallen world in particular ways. It's kind of like vices and sin, right? I mean, what is it about our relationship to reality when we are hung in certain kinds of vices and open to certain kinds of evil influence? It definitely is opening up ourselves to a fuller relationship to things that are there all along, but now we're related to it differently. That's why, I mean, the warnings all over Scripture are, don't do this. This opens the pathway up to these things, not just simply my subjective consequences, but real influence of evil and in its way of getting a hold. And so this is there. The question is, what's going on in these cases? Is it that this reality is able to let loose in a particular way because conditions have become made favorable in the whole realm of whatever else is going on in history and society? They don't always show up. I mean, you probably would have these things rid out the door quickly during the Enlightenment, not that they weren't happening, but just the way they would be interpreted, much less considered. There's a lot of things that get spawned by this, this conversation, because it really does cause you to ask questions about what exactly is the antenna that people are tapping into now and why.
There are a couple of things that I wanted to note. One is we tend to be influenced by a kind of psychological reductionism in ways that I don't think we appreciate. I mean, even in circles where people have rejected psychology in favor of some kind of biblical counseling, there's still a concession that your mind is sort of this sealed off space, as you're talking about, Tom. With getting back to Charles Taylor's distinction between
buffered self,
right?
Yeah.
So this idea that it's just in your head,
Yeah.
There's nothing that's influencing what is in your head. It's
Yeah.
just in
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
head.
Yeah.
And what you need to do is you need to get all that stuff out of your head and become, I guess, functionally a materialist,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if you're a believer.
Yeah.
But that, I think, is something that's being called into question for lots of reasons. And one of those reasons is getting back to this quantum stuff. So one of the challenging things about quantum theory is it's so counterintuitive, and the role of the observer is not merely passive anymore. It's understood to be active, which implies that there is an ongoing kind of interaction between our consciousness and the world outside our
Yeah.
heads, which is real, not just
Yeah.
in a projection.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a neophyte and all this kind of stuff, and I've probably said some things that a physicist would cringe at, but that at least is stuff that is popular in terms of our way of thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So the thing that we have to be aware of in the midst of all this is something that Chris brought up earlier, and that's that this is a real thing, at the very least at the level of people's belief. This is a religion that is emerging, and there is, frankly, a lot of spooky stuff about it. I don't think we can dismiss it out of hand, because within the Christian worldview, if we take the Bible seriously, there are these other dimensions to reality that interact with ours. The demonic is real, for example. But at the very least, we can't dismiss it, because there are people who believe it. And it is a growing thing in a number of circles, and a number of very important and influential circles. And the question is going to be, a lot of them are expecting this to really blow up as a very, very big deal thing, because Trump has promised to release all the government files, to declassify all the files on UFO, UAP stuff and all of that. If he really does, who knows? But they expect that if or when that happens, this is going to blow up, and it's going to cause a massive degree of worldview chaos. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I don't know. But we need to be aware that this is out there, and I think we need to be at least considering what its implications are for how we conduct ourselves in the world. We don't need to. We don't need to buy into all of the nonsense surrounding this, but we need to be aware that it's there. And we need to think about what the implications of the actual testimonies and evidence of people who have experienced some of this stuff are. We can dismiss it as being psychological, whatever. We can dismiss it as lies or whatever, but I'm not sure that's the best approach to take to it.
Yeah, I think to use another of Taylor's terms, which I think were good, we talked about the porous self, the one that is definitely open to realities more fully. You do see some of the breakdown of the kind of classic buffered self, as Chris was talking about, even with the whole woke movement, if you will. What I never saw before is the way in which categories and terms that have done psychological conditioning have this kind of religious grip on a people. I mean, we talk about it now as like Trump derangements, and these things are not just reducible to psychological conditioning. There's reality connections that allow for these things to take place. But I think one of the things that's interesting with Christian theology is the way sound doctrine on the one hand becomes one of the ways in which we create the right kind of buffer. But the other way is immersion in the proper spiritual life of our faith. This goes down to worship, spiritual lives, spiritual practices. These two become kind of the tool sets that the everyday Christian has to encounter these kinds of things in the healthiest of ways. Let's say there is more manifestation of this type of stuff, even if it's just in particular people's embracing it. You can't just, as Chris said, brush it off when it starts to enter this level of intensity. We have to be ready in the right kinds of way, but we also have to be prepared, because it is easy to get caught up ourselves into these kinds of things, especially when they do strike us as odd, and we may or may not have an interpretive place for it. And so theologically, we should be drawing on our richer metaphysic and our deeper understanding of what our faith teaches about the demonic and just the intelligible realms in particular, the hierarchies, if you will, of the kinds of things that are really there and that can begin to show up again.
So one of the things you noted, Glenn, is with some of these technopagans, they believe that these intelligences are giving them help, and this is helping them to come up with things that are making them successful and helping them to get money for their business ventures and things like that, capital and stuff. That's what I kind of am hearing when you mentioned that.
Actually, what happens is they're developing technologies that are making them a lot of money.
So
it's not just venture capital. It is the technologies that they develop from this download are actually work, and they work really well, and it creates very successful companies.
So the thing to consider with that, and I'm open to what you've just described. I'm not going to poo-poo it or anything. To me, it goes beyond even the fact that we have to take these things seriously because there are people who take them seriously. There's actually a sense in which these people believe that they're getting this help and it's making a difference in their lives. It's making them wealthier, right? So what we're up against is not just a set of beliefs, but what they see as practical to help. And when we respond to that, what do we say? What is the nature of our apologetic? Do we just again try to undermine it and say, "Oh, you're crazy. That would never happen. You're just making it all up," or do we take it seriously? And if we do take it seriously, what is our apologetic in terms of our response? Do we say, "Okay, you're making a deal with the devil, and you just don't see how it's cost you yet, but it's costing you"? Is that our approach? Do we take another approach that says, "Well, you just should try Jesus; he'll make you even richer"?
The lure is always the tough one, because that's usually the selling point of the demonic. In some way, it offers a help that somehow Christ can't offer or doesn't offer, right? I mean, this is sort of the same thing. You get, the cross, look at your God, helpless, right? And so here, let me fill that need you have, or that desire you have, and let me show you that what I do works. And then that's the hardest area to tap into.
Well, and what I'm getting at too here, Tom, is we're used to dealing with, say, perhaps uneducated people, third world people who believe these things. We're talking about a different class of people. We're talking about Stanford, Ivy League educated people who are making a lot of money in Silicon Valley people.
Yeah.
So and they're going to be able to respond to our questions and our challenge in a way that is a weird hybrid of medieval, magic and tremendously sophisticated technology.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in a lot of ways, remember what Rod Dreher said at the Touchstone Conference? He talked about running into somebody who had a shrine to Santa Muerte in New Orleans. And he talked to him and he said, why do you have the shrine here? And he said, because Santa Muerte has given me everything I've ever asked of her. It's really no different fundamentally from that.
Yeah.
The challenge on this is very real. And it may be that the best approach with someone like that is not to address that one head on.
Yeah.
Because there will be a point in their life where there will be a point of need. We have to address the issue fundamentally of sin and guilt. And that is, it may be that we have to put that one to the side and go for some of the more basic elements of the gospel and deal with this one later.
Yeah.
That might be the sort of the best approach here.
Yeah. And even though it isn't always successful on the immediate approach, but another thing is doing the kind of legwork we've been doing with a proper metaphysical vision and the proper ordering of things. When you're appealing to something that isn't fundamentally the source of all things, and you're finding yourself getting advances somehow from it, that opens up a series of metaphysical questions that can be, addressed. And then you could enter into conversations there. But it is much more difficult on that level, and it's not always successful, but it is part of any kind of comprehensive way of addressing these things. It's when you're dealing with something that is tangibly showing up for someone as real and blessing them in some way, you're dealing now with a set of spiritual competitions. And
the funny thing is, if you go back to how the church reacted to medieval magic, okay, the church, you can divide magic up in the Middle Ages into two categories. You've got natural magic, which is manipulating occult, that is to say, hidden forces that God has placed in the universe, and therefore is in principle okay. And you have, it's called by various names, but Guazzo in 17th century called it artificial magic, which is magic that's done through other means. That one's never licit. Okay. So when you're dealing with natural magic, though, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you know this? If it is natural magic, in principle, it's okay. But where did you get the knowledge to do this? And the core of that question is, if you obtain this knowledge from an illicit means, through some form of divination, through inquiring of demons or the dead or something like that, then your use of this natural magic is not licit because its origin is tainted. And there's something that's going on there because they didn't just give this to you gratis.
Yeah.
There's something that it is getting out of this.
Interesting.
So that was there, and it didn't matter whether you learned it from a teacher. Where did your teacher get it from? Because there's a problem with it fundamentally if it is coming from an illegitimate source.
Interesting.
Yeah, this brings up something I've mentioned in different settings, and that is, if I had been there with our first parents in the garden, the thing I would have whispered into Eve and Adam's ears, what is the snake getting out of this? Is it just that he just likes sharing his opinions, or is there something that he's up to that perhaps will put you in a really bad spot and him in what he perceives to be a better spot?
Yeah. So, it's really interesting because these issues that are brought up. Oh, by the way, Pasulka apparently has, reading a little bit between the lines, seems she has gotten offers of downloads. Yeah. And she's turned them down because she says that her intellectual independence, her intellectual integrity is not something that she's willing to compromise.
Yeah.
And she says, if you get an opportunity to do this, you don't have to take it. And she suggests you don't.
Yeah.
which I find rather interesting.
Yeah. That is. But I think your comment about how did the church address that is kind of it has a lot of wisdom in that still.
I mean, and this is medieval thinking, and it still proves to be relevant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really rather remarkable. I mean,
weighing the source of this is and how one accounts for the source of it, and not letting it be acceptable for people to remain agnostic about it. Like, I don't know how, because I really do think if you don't know, then you don't know what's going to happen or could happen. And those things are likewise. Another question, I mean, I know kind of a lot of these are just kind of jumping off of what the conversation spawns, but the notion of spiritual warfare. I'm not talking just kind of the extreme cases that we would talk about and not be for as Christians of, you see in some of the hyper charismatic episodes, but the real biblically valid one. I don't think as moderns and postmoderns, I don't think we still have a kind of depth that most of these high points in church history really did have a maturity with. And their wisdom, I think, is interesting, similar to the point you just made of looking at how they spiritually prepared to encounter certain things that were going to require something more than just a rational answer or set of answers.
Yeah. We have been so infected with modernity and modernity's assumptions that we don't really think seriously about the nature of spiritual warfare. We don't think seriously about the nature of the enemy. This is just not something that's there. And if we talk about why don't we go back to sort of the classical tradition within the church of these things, we dismiss it all too readily as being, well, that was back then. It's superstition. It's, we don't have chapter and verse on that in scripture. These kinds of things, ignoring the long practical experience and frankly, very well thought out in many cases approach that they've taken to this. It's I think this is again one of these cases where even if we don't have chapter and verse in scripture, the church tradition has got a lot of wisdom within it for dealing with this, and that's both Eastern and Western churches.
Yeah. And you do see more episodes live on mission fields, of course, and you hear a lot more of people having to draw upon those things more richly. But as you're mentioning, things in the spiritual oddities are starting to morph into Western world, if you will. I don't think we're going to be able to ignore those things on the spiritual level, much less the intellectual level. And like you said, when the intellectual level is such that it's going to require much more imagination to even be able to explain a lot of those biblical dimensions that we've kind of ignored, like the spiritual realm. And, I think figures like Lewis were aiming to do that very kind of thing. They gave us a lot to work with. But I think that on the spiritual level as well, I think we are just underprepared.
I think that the thing that's going to surprise pastors, particularly pastors who are not from a charismatic or Pentecostal orientation, are not of that orientation, is where this stuff's going to be coming from next. Again, I noted earlier that we tend to associate this way of thinking with people who don't go to places like Stanford. But what we're going to see more and more of is very sophisticated people, educated people, even wealthy people who do have an openness to things that. And then the question I've got for theological educators is, well, what are you guys doing to help pastors be prepared for this?
Yeah.
Now, this is so cutting edge and fresh and kind of weird and unprecedented. I'm not saying that seminaries have dropped the ball necessarily, although I do think they have been captive, by modernity in ways that they've not fully appreciated. And I hope that this serves as a wake-up call, just from the standpoint that, well, like I've implied, historically, you didn't need to think about this sort of thing too much when you served an upper middle class community. But I think we're going to see more and more of it, and guys need to be ready for it and have done some work to prepare for it before they encounter it.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. I don't know how widespread it is yet, but the indications are that we may be developing something of, at the very least, an elite religion that is going to have its popular level equivalencies. It maybe not too far off from some kind of Gnosticism type things, where you had a sort of an elitist version and popular versions as well. We may be looking at the development of something along those lines. Not a truly Gnostic thing, although that may be there as well, but sort of a parallel with what Gnosticism was, or Neoplatonism, where you had an elite Neoplatonism and a popular Neoplatonism in the ancient world. Now, one thing that we didn't even get into that I think, I don't know if anybody's been playing with this one, but it's one of the things that's sort of been in the back of my mind that I really wish Michael Heiser was still around, because I would really like to get his take on this stuff, because this could easily tie in, it seems to me, with some of the stuff he was doing around the beliefs surrounding the Nephilim and evil spirits. Because again, with what the belief was, the Nephilim who were killed in the flood, because they were part angelic, they turned into the evil spirits that were plaguing people in Jesus's day, and those evil spirits are still around. And they aren't demons. That's a different thing. The evil spirits and demons are sort of separate categories, according to Heiser. The evil spirits are the spirits of the Nephilim, and I would be really curious to see what Heiser would do with the with some of these kinds of things that we're seeing emerging in this world, and how he might integrate the two. It seems to me that there's a way that might be possible, but I haven't really worked on that enough to try to really put anything together on that. But it seems to me an intriguing idea.
Well, if I remember, what he was up to accurately, I might not, but he was working with a lot of extra biblical material,
Right.
And archaeological data that we now have that people haven't had access to in a while, because it had been lost, but now we've got it back. And so with that new data, we have a sense of what was going on even in the New Testament, in ways that people like, I don't know, B.B. Warfield would have no clue about.
Right.
Right. So,
and it is extra biblical, so we don't have to hold it in the same way that we hold the biblical texts.
Yeah.
But it did seem to form part of the mental furniture of the New Testament authors.
Oh, I agree, and I do think there are just even with a lot of the classical world, we are not picking up on things in the right way that people in the first century would have taken for granted. So, for example, when I mentioned to people that when the Hellenists are being referred to in the book of Acts prior to chapter 9, we're talking about Jews. In other words, Hellenized Jews.
Yeah.
Right.
And that the idea that Hellenism would have had that kind of impact on the Jewish community, for many people, particularly in the Reform world, that's like almost a heart attack inducing insight. because They
I
have this.
love Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what do
Because
do with
they have this
Philo? Come
idea.
on.
They have this idea that the Jews were hermetically sealed or something, and there were no Platonic ideas filtering in or anything like that. And it's like, you obviously don't read anything outside of maybe a very narrow range of Reformed literature from the 19th and early 20th century. So anyway.
So, this is admittedly a really weird topic. This is almost a Haunted Cosmos episode, except they would have gone straight to demons. But I think that this is, it's certainly not mainstream, at least not yet. But I think that there's a lot going on here that's worth noting. And if Pasulka is right, this is actually an emerging religion we need to be aware of.
Yeah.
And so I think it's definitely at least worth a discussion.
And I think connected to that is your earlier point that people, even that aren't drawn into its religiosity, are having experiences that are not able to be contained by the normal ways that they can be contained. Day in, day out, I know people who have photographs of these things that they're not sitting around making up. They're getting them constantly. And there's something happening that, that these varieties of interpretation, some of which will be religious, are definitely going to not be in the back seat any longer.
Well, that's a good note to end on there, Tom. So if you're out there in Pugcast land and you've had some experience that resonates with what we've been talking about, tell us in the comments or send us an email. It would be fascinating to know about it, and we can do a little bit of crowdsource research here on this matter. Is this something that people in our circles are actually familiar with? Anyway, thanks a lot for listening to this episode of the Theology Pugcast. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, that would be really appreciated. We have a link in the show notes for that, and there are different levels of support that you can provide, and we encourage you to do that because the bills have to be paid. All right, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.